Thank you, David, for the introduction. So now we're going to see the first results of the Heat Roadmap HRE4 project. The title of the presentation is Profiling Europe's Heating and Cooling Sector for the year 2015. So we look at the year 2015 only now. And in this presentation, we do not yet have maps, but maps are coming in the next presentation, so still one to go. So we basically, this is a very technical title, we basically looked at the question, what is the structure of heating and cooling demand in Europe at the moment? For which purposes do we use energy for heating and cooling in different countries, sectors, subsectors, etc.? So this, what I present now has been teamwork. We distinguish typically 4 sectors in our analysis. The industry sector, where the University of Utrecht, Keslina is somewhere here, has been working on, together with Fraunhofer ISI, so us. For the residential sector, residential buildings, it was mainly Fraunhofer ISI working on it. For the tertiary sector, we got support from Switzerland, Tap Energy. Ulrich Reiter is also somewhere here for questions in the very back. And on the cooling sector, so mainly space cooling in residential and tertiary sector, it is Armin from Paris working on that topic since years or decades. So we have a lot of expertise specialized on individual sectors, and now we try to look at this. We had this main goal in the work package, so disaggregating the heating and cooling demand in Europe by including end users and by including technologies for the year 2015. So what does it mean? I try to illustrate on the next slide. I have to move over anyway, maybe you can, hopefully you can still hear me in the back. What we see here is taken from the Eurostat website, it's final energy, it is the actually Sankey diagram of energy consumption in the EU 28. We start upstream on the left side and we can go to the right side, more downstream. First time that actually animations are working at a presentation. I'm still trying it all the time. So downstream here we are at final energy. We have the different colors show different fuels. We have the industry sector, the transport sector, and here we have services and residential sector. Eurostat also provides disaggregation to the individual subsectors. So we have the iron and steel industry, chemical, etc. Lots of industries. And here also agriculture, etc. But we don't know what is the share of heating and cooling of all this. We don't know what is the share of cooling. We don't know how much energy is used for, let's say, space heating, how much is used for process heating at high temperature levels. So all this was needed actually to develop a strategy and decision support for the heating and cooling sector is not yet available, although it's already a very large data set. So that is our starting point. We wanted to add this information on the very downstream side of the Sankey diagram. So we want to go more into the demand side, going towards from final energy to delivered heat and to different end users. And that's what we're going to do now. What does it mean more specifically? We distinguish energy. We distinguish energy carriers, as also Eurostat does. We have distinguished the different sectors, residential, tertiary, and industry. For some, we add some more information, like subsectors for the tertiary sector, like single-family, multi-family building houses for the residential building sector. And then finally, we include end users. And for us, this is space heating, water heating, space cooling, process heating, where we distinguish different temperature levels from low temperature to very high temperature processes. And also process cooling, where also here we distinguish different process, different temperature levels. Yeah, but okay. Maybe last word on that side. And then we have technologies also included, and we developed a matrix that combines all of these dimensions, so it becomes a very large table for all the 28 individual member states. In terms of method, we used a combined approach by collecting all data that is available from different statistics, of course using Eurostat as a basis, but then also from Odyssey, from all the EU projects that have been conducted so far. And we combined that with our bottom-up model forecast. I will not talk about that model in detail now. There's more information available on that website. And we combined that all this kind of bottom-up technology, structural information in the model to produce these 2015 end-use energy balances. We were lucky. We have done a similar study last year for the European Commission, where we had a little different focus, where we looked at 2012, for example, only. So compared to this study, we have now updated all this for the year 2015, so it's very brand new. We have included technologies. We have a lot more detail on the cooling sector, which was always the weak point before. And we include a lot of indicators and a lot of more things. Data sources, of course, there are many. This is just a selection. I don't go into the details here. To have some time to show you a few results, at least, before you see the PETA thermal maps. So the connection between these results and the maps that you see in the next presentation is that what we see here is the total value for a whole country, and this is then disaggregated in the next step, in the next presentation, to a kind of regional level. So this is kind of the first step in developing those maps. Always starting with the same slide. We learned that already, that heating and cooling is about 50% of the final energy consumption in Europe. I think it was 50% in 2012, and now in 2015, surprisingly, it is still 50%, or let's say about 50%. Depends if you include cooking or if you include fridges or not. So, but it will remain 50% also for the coming 3 years and a bit longer. So let's go a bit deeper into the details here. From this 50% in the heating and cooling sector, the most important subsectors or end users is space heating, with again about 50%, and process heating in industry. So thinking about policies, these two segments already require a very different policy approaches, and together they make up for about 80% of the heating and cooling sector. Cooling, actually, we always say heating and cooling. Cooling today, at least if you count it final energy, has quite a significantly lower importance at the EU level. In some countries, it has still a high importance, as we will see soon. Actually here. So we have the same disaggregation now shown by country. We can see that the pattern varies by country quite heavily, although space heating and process heating is very important in all the countries. Also in the southern countries, space heating is important, and process heating depends on the structure of the industry, but it is important in most countries. Cyprus and Malta are always a kind of exception. Don't look at these very tiny countries. Yeah. Small countries. Cooling. Cooling, of course, is also. I was just referring to this figure, right? Not in general. I encourage you to visit those two countries, and I probably is good. Okay, let's talk about cooling. Cooling is, as you see, cooling is green in this figure, and in some countries it is quite important, in others it is not very important. In the future it might be more important. We will see that in the next presentations, in the next events. And if you count it as primary energy, it will also be more important because it's mostly based on electricity, so it gets a higher share in the total energy use. So we can look at energy carriers also in this disaggregation. What we see is that natural gas, if you look at final energy, natural gas is used for about 40% of the heating and cooling supply. So it's very important in total. Fossil fuels account for about 66% in 2015, and renewables are about 13%. And then we have electricity and district heating as secondary energy carriers. We can also disaggregate them if we look at primary energy, which is here. Unfortunately, we only have this for 2012. We disaggregate electricity and district heating to renewables and fossil fuels, and we see that actually fossil fuels is about 67% and renewables is about 17%. So still quite a way to go towards the decarbonization. If we now, this was a general overview, we've worked, as I said in the beginning, on the different sectors, industry, tertiary, and residential sector. What you see here is the structure by sector, and in terms of end users, of course, not surprisingly, process heating is very important in industry, space heating in the residential sector, but also in the tertiary sector. And now let's go a bit into the industry sector to learn a bit more what is the level of detail we were working on. For industry, we distinguish not only end users, but also temperature levels. And we see here that process heating is, of course, most relevant, but actually process heating on very high temperature levels. So process heating above 500 degrees Celsius, which is all the furnaces in the basic materials industry, cement, steel, glass, etc., accounts for more than 40% of heating and cooling energy demand in the industrial sector in the EU. So it is a huge energy demand, and it's very difficult to decarbonize at the same time. We can now include subsector information. I was already talking about subsectors. We see here what I mentioned already, that iron and steel has a very high share of high temperature heat demand. Others, like the machinery sector, has more space heating demand. And the pulp and paper industry needs steam between 100 and 200 degrees Celsius. So we can look at those details of industrial heat demand here. So one main conclusion is, even without looking at the details, that the structure is very diverse. So the subsectors are all different. So actually strategies require looking at the different subsectors for the industrial sector. Makes it quite challenging as well. And yes, here we can include energy carriers. I'm going to go faster to the maps. We have all this, of course, also per country. Country figures are anyway too small to see in this room, so let's just compare two countries, Italy and Sweden. We see here the end users on the x-axis, and actually the energy carriers as colors. And we see that the industrial sector in those two countries has a very different structure. Sweden on the one side is dominated by the pulp and paper industry, huge share of biomass, huge demand of steam at about 200 degrees Celsius or a bit less. While Italy has a more diverse industry, has a huge steel industry as well, a lot of process heating demand where also coal is used, and lots of natural gas, and a lot less biomass. So the structure of the industry also strongly affects the structure of the countries in terms of energy use. So just to mention, we have other sectors, the tertiary sector. For the tertiary sector, the nice thing of this analysis is that we went quite far way beyond Eurostat, because we also included subsectors, which is not available from Eurostat final energy. And what we see from this overall analysis, the wholesale and retail trade sector is the individual most important subsector, but also the other subsectors from education, health, public offices, finance, they are all quite important, but they also have a different structure in terms of heating and cooling demand. Some need process heat, others need lots of cooling, while others, again, mostly require space heating. And also the residential building sector is included, of course. We have distinguished here single-family and multi-family houses. Just to give you one fact, for the EU 28, we see that single-family houses in total account for twice as much final energy consumption as multi-family houses. So this is also relevant in terms of policy strategy. And to make the transition towards the mapping presentation a bit smoother, I have included one map, a very simple one still, which shows the share of single-family houses in the individual countries. And here also we see a huge diversity, the UK with 90% and Spain with 35%. So again, as I've shown, only the average, but when we look at country-specific values, the situation often is very different than the EU average is. Now, a few main conclusions. Heating and cooling counts for about 50% of final energy demand. This figure, at least, should be well known now. What we have done is kind of calibrated to the Eurostat energy balances, and I would say it is complete in terms of energy balance. With the modeling approach, we were able to fill data gaps. Of course, it is not perfect. There's also certain areas that can be improved. I'm thinking of space cooling is always uncertain. The square meters that are cooled actually in the individual countries is very uncertain parameter. Also, the use of renewable energies in industry and the service sector is not so well accounted for. So there are certain elements that can be improved, of course, but it is a kind of first complete data set that is quite robust in overall. And yes, as I said, that this will be used in the Heat Roadmap Europe project. On the one side for the maps as input for the maps, where it's disaggregated to the regional level, and on the other side it will be the starting point for the scenarios towards 2015 and for the decarbonization scenario. And yeah, so much about 2015 and country averages, and now we can go to the maps and see what's going on in those countries.